Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law News produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright, and we're just going to run through some of the news stories that have been coming out this week. I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Amelia. So my name is Peter. I'm a solicitor and the managing director at Digital Law, and we've got some interesting stories to bring to you this week. The idea behind these discussions is just to give you a flavour of just some of the conversations that take place in our office on a regular basis, and we've got some interesting breaches and interesting regulatory stories for you this week. So I will pass you back to Amelia.
Thanks, Peter. So our first story this week is regarding WhatsApp. So WhatsApp has rewritten its privacy policy for European users that have been handed a record €225 million fine by Irish data protection regulators earlier this year. So in its decision, the DPC found that WhatsApp had not been transparent enough about the way it had been handling users' data. And so the new policy, which was published on Monday, includes more detail about how the Meta-owned company collects and uses customer data, how it stores and when it is deleted. So I'll hand over to Peter to kind of talk through the rest of this one.
Thanks, Amelia. So once again, for the benefit of those at the back, this is an exemplar of the fact that WhatsApp is not suitable for business-related purposes. If you are either using it for work or you're considering using it for work, don't is the takeaway from this. So WhatsApp has been fined almost €250 million for failing to have sufficiently clear and transparent policies in place with regards to how it uses personal data. Why is this important? Well, it shows that really Facebook, Freudian slip there, Facebook and WhatsApp are of course the same company, owned now by the holding company Meta, as introduced by Mark Zuckerberg a few weeks back. The whole point here is that WhatsApp has not been sufficiently demonstrating compliance with GDPR since GDPR was introduced in May of 2018. Ultimately, this is a piece of software that's designed for instant messaging, and it really is not sufficiently secure or safe, and it does not demonstrate compliance with data protection law, most of all. So if you are using it for business purposes, you are in effect using a platform that the European data protection regulators are saying is not sufficiently fit for purpose as far as data protection compliance is concerned. If you are in a highly regulated business, so for example, if you're a doctor's surgery telling people about appointments via WhatsApp, that's not a particularly secure platform to use. You'd be better off using SMS. If you are a law firm or an accountant, it is not a sufficiently secure platform for communicating with your clients. If you're in financial services, it is definitely not appropriate to be discussing transactions and deals with clients. So it comes down to the point that it is simply not sufficiently secure, and it does not demonstrate compliance with the law in both Europe and the UK when it comes to data protection, and it is not able to comply with what it needs to. So if you are a highly regulated business and you need to then demonstrate that you are keeping data safe and secure to a regulator, if you're using WhatsApp, the regulator will point and go, well, why were you using that? That's the point with this. So WhatsApp is facing this rather large fine. It is unlikely that the presence of a new privacy policy will make a blind bit of difference with regards to that fine, which it is in the process of appealing. But I must add that I think this is a piece of enforcement that the data protection regulators have thought about very carefully. If this fine were to be successfully challenged and appealed against, it would bring into question the whole culture of enforcement of GDPR and data protection law in Europe. So they should have made very, very clear very, very early on the basis for the fine and the enforcement, and it is at first glance difficult to see how an appeal is going to change that. Certainly putting in a new privacy policy isn't really going to help an awful lot. What's more, when they're saying, this privacy policy tells you about the legitimate basis upon which we process data, and it tells you how long we retain that data and what we do with it, that does then beg the question, well, why wasn't your version in place from 2018 doing that? Because that's what a privacy policy is supposed to do. So it will be interesting to therefore see how this now develops and whether the appeal process upholds the enforcement or whether WhatsApp is successful in getting it reduced or indeed set aside.
Exactly, Peter. I guess we'll just have to wait and see with what happens with the appeal. And so our next story, kind of sticking with Meta and Facebook. So this is in regards to the Irish data protection has demanded none of your business to sign a non-disclosure agreement or remove the page from Facebook. So none of your business has filed a criminal report against the DPC, which is the Irish Data Protection Commission. And they have taken unheard of moves to demand none of your business to draft and sign a non-disclosure agreement within one working day. I will pass you over to Peter to kind of continue to talk this one through.
Yes, so this is an interesting one. Noyb, none of your business, is the not-for-profit that was set up by Max Schrems. Max Schrems famously was behind the Schrems 1 and Schrems 2 decisions, the first of which blew apart the basis for the processing of the personal data of EU citizens in the United States under what was then called the Safe Harbor mechanism, and the Schrems 2 decision destroyed the EU-US Privacy Shield, which allowed for the transfer and sharing of data of EU citizens in the United States. So currently we're waiting for whatever this is going to replace the Privacy Shield. But in the meantime, Mr. Schrems is keeping himself busy. He is continuing to make complaints to the Irish Data Protection Commissioner, which is the regulator for Facebook, because Facebook's European servers are based in the Republic of Ireland. And on his website, noyb.eu, you can see the correspondence that's been exchanged between the Irish Data Protection Commissioner and Noyb. And the point here is that in continuing to file complaints with the Data Protection Commissioner, the Data Protection Commissioner is turning around and saying, you have to sign an NDA, otherwise we will not continue to process your complaints. And the thing here is that Max Schrems is then saying, well, hang on, we are merely reporting to you, the regulator, transgressions that we think Facebook is making in not complying with the law. Why should we have to comply with an NDA? Max Schrems would not want what could be his third decision to be interfered with or fettered in any way by a non-disclosure agreement. So it really shows here that he's not wanting to be in a position whereby he's not able to publicize the work that he and his not-for-profit are undertaking when it comes to trying to hold Facebook to account with their regulator. So it's an interesting and bizarre move that the Irish Data Protection Commissioner has taken here. I think we need to bear in mind that the DPC in Ireland it really does not have sufficient funds to be able to carry out heavy-duty regulation of these massive tech companies. And in an instance like this, the not-for-profit Noyb has probably got fairly similar resources to the Irish Data Protection Commissioner. So the DPC is seeking to stop there being any further publicity or indeed use by Noyb of the information that they may get as a result of their ongoing complaints. And ultimately, as a privacy campaigner, Max Schrems is not going to want to agree to any form of an NDA, and that's why he has, in his native Austria, filed a report of this incident of what would appear to be blackmail and coercion, saying you must sign this NDA, otherwise we will not deal with your complaints, saying that this is in effect a request by the Irish Data Protection Commissioner for a speech marks, in quotes, quid pro quo, close speech marks, that wonderful phrase that we all got very familiar with in the last year of Donald Trump's presidency. So the point here is that he has reported this in Austria because ultimately, by trying to say you have to fill in the NDA and sign it, otherwise we won't deal with the claim, he says that constitutes bribery under Austrian law. So therefore, Austria should investigate this action by the Irish Data Protection Commissioner. All a bit of a mess, all something that could probably have been taken care of if calmer heads were prevailing, but clearly this is not happening. And this is just an example of the ongoing thorn in Facebook's side that Max Schrems and his not-for-profit Noyb have become.
So moving on to our next story today. So this is about a suspected data breach at the Dorset Council, and it is to be investigated by the Information Commissioner's Office, also known as the ICO. This potential breach was first noticed in September, according to the Local Democracy Reporting Service. So this issue affected one department and has been flagged as amber on the council's traffic light risk grading system. So I will pass over to Peter to continue this.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, it looks like at the moment not an awful lot of information is in the public domain because it's been reported that this breach occurred in September, and it's probably been reported, well, it will have been reported to the Information Commissioner's Office. They'll be investigating, and then they may or may not take regulatory action and enforcement on the back of it. I think the key thing to bear in mind, though, here is that even before the introduction of GDPR, the long list of monetary penalty notices enforced by the UK Information Commissioner was always very heavily weighted towards the public sector, very heavily weighted towards local authorities. And as we can see here, local authorities continue to fall foul of data protection law and have significant data protection breaches, which is a concern given that by their nature local authorities are usually dealing with very large volumes of what can be very sensitive personal data. So who knows what information this relates to? Don't forget local authorities do things like running care homes, so they can sometimes be handling people's medical records. They can be handling financial records if people are being means tested for the support they may receive from their local authority. Before too long, you can see that there could be an awful lot of very sensitive data involved in here, and by definition, our local authorities dealing with tens of thousands of people's personal records. So this is a concern. And who knows where it may end, though I think it's also worth pointing out that in terms of enforcement by the UK Information Commissioner in relation to data protection breaches, the actual volume and size of enforcement when it comes to GDPR post 2018 has been very small. As I say, GDPR incorporated into the UK by the UK Data Protection Act 2018.
So moving on to our last story of the day. This comes from the UK's National Cyber Security Centre, the NCSC, and it has been warning the owners of more than 4,000 online stores that their sites have been compromised in magcart attacks, which steal customers' payment information. So in the magcart attacks, also known as web skimming, digital skimming, or e-skimming, the threat actors inject scripts known as credit card skimmers, also known as payment card skimmers or web skimmers, into compromised online stores to harvest and steal the payment and or personal information submitted by the customers at the checkout page. So I will pass on to Peter for more information.
Thank you, Amelia. So I think this is a very timely story because it goes, in particular with the current supply chain disruption, lots of people are undertaking their Christmas shopping, and many are doing it a little bit earlier than they might otherwise have done so they can buy things while they see them now. A beneficiary of this in many instances has been small businesses where they might have specific gifts and things available. And of course, during the course of the pandemic, lots of businesses, sometimes high street shops, traders, have started to open up their own little online stores so that they could continue to trade during the conditions of the pandemic when it wasn't possible to do these things in person. So while that's great that those businesses were able to get online and still make money, it is then a worry and significant concern that the government here through the National Cyber Security Centre is saying that thousands of, potentially more than 4,000 individual online stores could have been affected by this hack. The use of payment skimming software isn't a new thing, but as you can imagine, it can potentially get a hacker a very large sum of money for a comparatively small amount of effort if it is skimming amounts off individual transactions. Even if you're only skimming a few pennies off each transaction, if you're doing that on hundreds of thousands of transactions, that all begins to mount up very, very quickly. We also know at the moment there is a lot of pent-up demand in the economy. There are very high sales. Some organisations are experiencing very high turnovers. So therefore, all it takes is a little bit of skimming here and there for people to be skimming off quite a bit of cash potentially during this time, particularly when, due to the volume of transactions, merchants and customers might not be checking their bills too carefully. So that's the bad part of the story. The good thing is that at least this guidance has been issued to say this is a problem and be aware of it. The UK National Cyber Security Centre has is part of the UK's mission to say that the UK should be hopefully the safest place in the world to do business online. So they do have significant resources from the government's GCHQ, Government Combined Communications headquarters, and they are clearly investigating these sorts of ongoing breaches and trying to therefore issue help and guidance where they can. However, the point here is that there can be significant security vulnerabilities in some of the online payment platforms. So what's the big takeaway? Make sure you are updating your payment platforms, make sure there are no vulnerabilities in there, and make sure that you aren't putting off any updates, stopping things from being updated, because that can mean that you're then opening up vulnerabilities in turn. So it is really important to try and stay on top of these things, even though you might be very, very busy turning around lots of orders at the busiest time of the year. I think it's very important to make sure that systems are properly up to date and that you aren't running with a vulnerability that these hackers could exploit.
Precisely, and that's kind of specifically looking towards Black Friday. This is where people, obviously, it's one of the big days of the year where there are so many offers around, where people, like you say, are not necessarily going to notice that skimming off the top because there is just such a high demand.
Indeed, happy Thanksgiving to our US viewers and listeners. And indeed, this is something to consider when it comes to trying to take advantage of those sales. And also, it's interesting as well in terms of the different type of payment software that might be used. And Amelia, we were talking about this earlier when you made a remark about Apple Pay potentially offering a little bit more security, though I think it would be dangerous to rely on this too much, but that might give at least a little bit of reassurance to Apple users.
Yes, in addition to this, I believe it was on the NCSC website, they did recommend using credit cards to make online payments, just because often in the credit card kind of policy, there is the fact that most of the time they can actually help you get your money back from such kind of fraudulent transactions. And this is not always the case with kind of Visa and debit.
Exactly. So it's really important to, if you can, pay on credit card, though we would of course not be endorsing leaving it on there and not paying it off. But if you're buying through a credit card and then paying it off, you benefit from the protections of the Consumer Credit Act. That means that if the merchant you are buying from, if you don't receive the product, if there is something wrong and you receive the wrong product or it's defective, you are covered through the Consumer Credit Act. And that could mean that even if there is then a breakdown of the relationship with the vendor selling you the product, you could go through the credit card company and get a refund that way. So at least you aren't then having paid out the money and totally left high and dry, which would be the case if you pay using a debit card. Furthermore, as well, if you pay with a credit card, that means that the only sum at risk is the funds on the credit card. If you're paying using your debit card and that account is then compromised, of course, they could get into your bank account and your hard-earned money may be at risk. So there is certainly a very strong incentive there to use your credit card when it comes to your purchases. But as I say, we would also strongly recommend paying it off as quickly as you can after you've used it.
Certainly, and I think if you want any more information on this, the NCSC do actually have their own Black Friday kind of guidance, as well as kind of including Cyber Monday in this as well. So if you wish to have more information on that, head over to the NCSC website and they'll be able to give you some more guidance. So that was our last story for today. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this webinar, and we'll hopefully be back next week with another episode. Just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, YouTube channel, and the podcast channels such as Spotify and Apple Music. Thank you for listening, and I hope that we see you again very soon.